Let's take a look at these two questions. How and why has Kenilworth changed over time? These two make up sections C and F of the assessment criteria. And it's not so much the uses of Kenilworth we're thinking here. We're thinking really specifically about what Kenilworth looks like and the kind of features that are at the castle. Now, when we're thinking about these questions, it's really helpful for us to think about those four main time periods. So let's have a quick refresh and think about this first point, the ways in which the site has changed. So, as we know so well, the castle begins as a kind of a military structure. It becomes more of a palatial residence before turning into ruins. And finally, of course, it becomes more of a tourist destination. Now, in these questions, we're not just describing these different time periods, we're really specifically thinking how does Kenilworth actually change in these different eras? What new buildings are there, and why are those constructed? A nice way to think about it, perhaps, is to look at this picture. Here's Kenilworth at probably its kind of most developed point. We see it in its regal beauty during the palatial era. So we obviously see the big garden Robert Dudley has constructed for Elizabeth. But Kenilworth didn't always look like this. So, how over time did it develop? And again, why did those changes take place? So it would be helpful for us to have a few examples for each of the eras. So let's begin with the military era. How does Kenilworth change in these years? So first of all, first major change is that Kenilworth begins as a wooden structure, but very quickly a stone keep, the Great Tower, is built. That's built with the support of King Henry I and a place for Geoffrey de Clinton to live, as well as this strong defensive building. Later developments in the military era happen specifically because the castle gets taken into royal control in the 1170s. So this leads to significant building works completed by Henry II, but especially John I, who spends a fortune developing Kenilworth, and some good examples of that are the Outer Curtain Wall and Mortimer's Tower. And another really big way Kenilworth changes at this time is the mere is extended. It becomes the biggest mere in all of England. So if we look at this picture is around the time of King John. It shows how the castle may have looked at this time. And again, we can think, well, Kenilworth didn't look like that when it first got built in the 1120s, but 100 years later, this is how it looks. So what has changed? Well, first of all, we've had the Great Tower, was built in stone. It's actually had another floor added to it by King John. We've got these big defensive developments, the outer wall, Mortimer's Tower there, and we've got this massive extension of the mere. So even within the military era, we are seeing big changes as the decades go by. Moving into the palatial times, and of course, this is going to see massive changes to the way Kenilworth looks and the kind of buildings that are seen at the site. So we start to see things like big kitchens, a chapel, a series of great halls developed, and a huge deer park being constructed, really representing the changes in the way the castle is being used. Specifically, as a really good example for us, we've got John of Gaunt. The castle changes massively when he takes ownership of the castle. He's a very rich, wealthy man, spends huge amounts, most famously on the great hall that he builds. We have things like the Pleasance in the Marshes, we have a tennis court, all these things, small changes perhaps, but over time they show the way the site is changing. And then in the palatial era, the final big changes happen with Robert Dudley's developments. And we can think about the big garden, Leicester's building, Leicester's gatehouse. So on this picture, it might be helpful just to remind ourselves of a few key things. There's the Great Hall, John of Gaunt's Great Hall, so that's developed in the palatial era. We have Elizabethan Garden, big change to the site. We have a big stable developed in the back there. We have Leicester's building. So lots of changes within the palatial era over time as ownership changes, as people have different purposes and uses for the castle, and different levels of money and fashion and all that kind of stuff. Thinking about the final remaining eras, these are less significant really for this question, but worth us just touching on briefly. How does the castle change in the ruins and tourist eras? So, first of all, of course, in the ruins era, buildings are either destroyed or they fall into ruins. There's one building which remains in kind of good shape and is lived in, so that's Leicester's Gatehouse. And then as the tourist era begins, we start to see some big changes, particularly more recently. So the castle gets looked after, gets cleaned up, gets preserved. The Elizabethan garden got restored in 2009, and we start to see things like cafes, museums, and shops being added to the site. So again, we see that even within these eras later on, there are changes to the site. Now, the second question we had to think about that's kind of tied in with this is, why do these changes take place? So I think we could break this down into three main reasons. Number one, there are different owners of Kenilworth throughout its history, and the different owners use the castle for different things. It's actually quite unique, Kenilworth, in the sense that there are so many different people that are owning the castle at different points, and very often they have different needs and different desires for how the castle is going to work for them. So if we think of just three examples, King John needs the castle to shore up his power, to act as a defence against possible rebellion. John of Gaunt wants to use the castle to show off his wealth and his kind of position in society. And later on, Robert Dudley's going to take over the castle and use it to woo Queen Elizabeth and try to show his suitability to her. So those are just three examples, but each owner of the castle brings something different. So any new owner is going to bring a kind of change to the castle. Point number two that can help explain why Kenilworth has changed, the changes to the site over time, would be thinking about some major events at Kenilworth which kind of act as turning points. So when these events happen, it leads to big changes in the site. So we have two things we could talk about here, right? We've got the Great Siege of 1266. So after this turning point, Kenilworth is really going to change. It's going to be less needed for kind of military and defensive purposes. It's going to get taken into the royal household, and it's going to become more of a palatial place. So that's directly related to this kind of big event that takes place and causes a kind of chain reaction of events. Much later on, a second major turning point is, of course, the slighting of the castle in 1649. And very clearly, this big event is going to lead to a big change in the site. It's going to lead to the site being unlivable, and therefore it's going to fall into ruins. The final point that we could use to explain reasons for changes is simply that changes at Kenilworth reflect changes in society. So when England changes, Kenilworth changes. Here's a couple of examples. So when England becomes more kind of peaceful, that means there's a less need for defensive castles. This can help explain why Kenilworth becomes more palatial. And then later on, like we've just been thinking about with the slighting and the Civil War, big events in society, big questions about power between the king, the royalists, and the parliament, that is going to lead to big changes at Kenilworth too. So the slighting of the castle is actually just linked with wider things going on across England, and the changes at Kenilworth are directly related to these bigger events and things going on. So how would we answer a kind of exam question based around these questions? Well, here's an example from a few years back. It says, explain why the physical features of your site have changed over time. So it's asking why the changes have taken place, not just what the changes are. And it's really thinking here about physical features. So remember to read the questions really carefully and think what they are asking you to do. So in this case, we have to explain why new buildings were added, buildings changed over time. So how could we answer this question? Well, the key thing to remember is we're not just telling a story. We're not just describing. We're going to use words from the question to help make sure we're explaining, we're being analytical. So each paragraph, each main point we are going to use words from the question. So we might start off one paragraph with one reason why the physical features have changed over time is because, and we'll explain a reason. We'll give an example. Remember, we'll keep on coming back to actual physical features. And before getting tempted to start describing and telling a story, we're going to start a new paragraph, which is going to say another reason why there was a change in physical features is. We'll then give an example, and we'll keep on using words like therefore, which help make sure we're kind of explaining. So just take a note here of how I've used words from the question in these kind of sentence starters, and really thought that I'm going to link directly my knowledge to exactly what the question is asking by using words from the question and keeping that type focus. You could have a go at writing up a few sentences for this, a paragraph or two as preparation.